Isn't this a beautiful project? Just look at how flat the top is, and the construction is just perfect. And this is a solid wood glue-up. I'm Jim Heavey from Wood Magazine, and I've made countless projects calling for solid wood panels like this. In this video, I'll show you the ways to effectively and consistently create good-looking, structurally sound, and flat panels for your projects. And it all starts from the ground up. Now, when I said from the ground up, I mean actually purchasing the stock you're planning on making your project with. And there's three ways to do that. The first is called in the rough, or rough sawn. This is the way it comes from the mill. If I turn this around the back side, you'll actually see the mill marks. This is the most labor-intensive but cheapest way to buy material, because ultimately you're going to have to send this through a joiner and flatten the bottom and then thickness it. You're then going to go to the joiner and clean up one side, and finally on the table saw to cut it to width. When I look at wood like this, sometimes when I see it in the rough, it's hard for me to see the grain or maybe the color of the wood or some of the imperfections. But if you've got the tools and the time to do it, you really can't beat the price. The second way to buy material is called S2S. That's where the mill has done two of those operations for you. They've already flattened the bottom and they've thicknessed it. The only thing left for you is to joint one edge and then finally clean it up on the table saw. You'll pay a little bit more for this stock, but in many cases it makes it easier to read it. In this case, I can kind of see the color of that board. I can kind of watch what happens with the grain. I can also see some of the imperfections in here, which may change my decision to buy that particular piece of wood. The third way to buy lumber is called S4S, and here all the operations are done. This has already been jointed, thicknessed, edge jointed, and finally cut to size. This is the wood you'll normally find in home centers and the better lumber yards. It normally comes in standard widths and lengths. You'll pay a little bit more for this, but if you don't have the tools to do some of these other things, that may fit the bill perfectly. Now lastly, when you're selecting your material, be fairly particular here. Look down the end grain of that board and make sure it's nice and straight. We don't want to see a cup in that board. Sight the long end of that board and make sure that that's also straight. I want to see a bow here. And if you can find a flat spot by touching opposite corners and the board doesn't move, it means that what you've got is a board without a twist in it. Now, flat glue-ups call for flat stock. A twist or a cup or a bow are a problem, and removing those in your shop means reducing the thickness, the width, and the length of those boards. So be very particular when you buy your stock. And lastly, when you bring it back to your shop, it is not a good idea to stack it like this, where it's all flat one piece against another. The moisture conditions in the place that you bought it and where you're planning on using it are probably different. And these boards are going to give off or take in moisture to acclimate to your shop conditions. If they're stacked up like this, air can't move around that board, and what's going to happen is these boards will react to those changes without doing it evenly. The best way to take care of that is using a set of stickers like these. These are plywood. You can make them out of anything. They're about 3/4 by 3/4. By evenly spacing and stacking your boards with these stickers, air can move evenly all around them. Moisture can go out and come back in and do it evenly so that the boards gently expand and contract without that potential of twist or cup or bow. And now it's time to do your layout. And layouts can be done for color or grain. And arranging those boards can either add an awful lot of impact or provide a more monolithic type surface. One of the ways to do it is to provide even color all the way across. You'll have to be real careful when you buy your lumber to make sure that it's all the same color tint in effect, so that when you put the boards together it looks all even. But in many cases what we get are some boards that are slightly lighter than others, some darker. So one of the ways to do this is doing it for color and arranging the darker boards on the outside and fade to a lighter board on the inside. Or maybe the reverse of having lighter to darker. On larger type projects, it looks very nice to have a slight change in the color because it draws your eyes more to the middle of the project. It doesn't make it look quite as large. So that's one way to do it with color. Another one is to do it with grain. I've got a sample here of a board with relatively wild grain. You'll see it down the center and somewhat straighter grain on the outside. By pairing this up with straighter grain on both edges here, we can kind of take the more wild grain, blend it with somewhat straighter grain, and then go back to the slightly wilder again. It's kind of a nice look. One of the other ways to do this is actually use grain as an impact. And here's what I've done. If you find stock thick enough, take this to your bandsaw and just cut it in half. The process is called book matching. As I open these, you'll see that I now have a mirror image of the inside of the grain. It's a real nice look that draws your eye to the middle. I can do the same thing by flipping the boards over and using the outside edges the same way. This little V pattern that points itself to me is also a nice look. But whether you do it with grain or you do it with color, you're still going to have to mark these boards so that their jointed edges will match up. I do that by taking a piece of chalk and just marking a V across them. That way if I put the V back together again after jointing, I'm fine. I do 3-board glue-ups. When I do mine, I like to mark my edges with X's and O's. That way I just have to match those back up when I'm done, and that's aligned the way it's supposed to be. When I talked about jointing the edges, what I'm talking about is providing an edge that is perfectly 90 degrees to the face of the board. That can be done on a joiner, a tool specifically for that purpose, or a table saw. Let's go to the joiner first. This is a 6-inch joiner, and it's probably typical of the one that you've got in your shop. But before you use it, you have to make sure that your fence and tabletop are at 90 degrees. To check those, I like using a machinist square like this. I'll check it on the left side, and then check it on the right side to assure that I'm at 90 degrees. Check the owner's manual to make any adjustments if it's not 90 degrees. I like using a machinist square because I really like it. I know it's square. Make sure that the square you're using is square. Now here's how you can check to see if your square is square. Put it up against a straight edge. Put a pencil line on the outside edge of that tongue and flip the blade to the other side and see if that line lines up. As long as the reveal is the same all the way around, you have a square square. Now another thing on the joiner, the outboard table is fixed and it's at the same height as the cutter blades. The infeed table is parallel to the outfeed table but lower, and in this case about a 32nd of an inch. That's how much material we're going to take off every pass we make with that board. So it's important to keep the board edge flat on the table and up against the fence. Pressure is put on the infeed side until the board passes over the cutters, and then pressure is put on the outfeed side to continue the cut. This will assure a 90-degree edge and an edge with no snipes and no bowing on it. Here's how it works. Okay, again, down against the table, up against the fence. Slow, easy push to the opposite side. Now you notice a nice clean edge. There's no sniping at the front and back. This is a real nice straight edge with no bows in it at all. Now had you noticed individual saw marks in here, you're moving a little too fast. Slow your feed speed down some. If you notice some chipping on the edges, all you need to do is reverse the direction of that board. That'll make the grain run a little bit more correctly for the joint that you're planning on doing. This is a really nice, clean, jointed edge. This is what we're looking for. Now jointing a board on a jointer works, but it's not the only tool to use. A table saw also works very well. In fact, in some cases, a thicker, wider, longer board is better supported on a tabletop. So let me show you a few things you have to check on the table saw first, and then we'll go through the jointing on a table saw. So the first thing is, much like we did with a joiner, I just want to make sure that my table saw blade is at 90 degrees to the table. And again, back to my trusty machinist square. Once I'm sure of that, I'm all set to go. I want to now make sure that my blade is parallel to the fence. There's a few different ways to do that. One of the first ways is to use an adjustable square like this. By putting the square in the groove just to the right of the saw blade. Now the groove is parallel to the blade. So by putting the adjustable square in the groove and extending the blade, I can slide my fence up to that blade and lock it in there. And if I test it here and test it here and see that the offset is the same, my fence is parallel to the blade. It's a great way to do it. Now there is an alternate to doing it. If you don't have a square like this, if your table has extensions on them, like this one does, you can use the left side of the fence, slide that up to that extension, and when you sight down the edge of the fence onto that extension, it should be even all the way, since the extension is parallel to the groove, which in turn is parallel to the blade. If you have a smaller saw that doesn't have extensions, using the right side of the fence and lining that up with the end of the saw does the same thing. But no matter which method you use, there's one real good way to check and see whether or not the alignment is perfect. And here's how it's done with a piece of wood. I'm going to take this board and I'm going to cut an edge off of it. And when I send the board through the blade, you should only hear cutting at the front part of the blade as the back side of this wood passes the blade. If it's cutting all the way through, it means the saw is cutting at the front and the back of that blade. It's making a smaller saw work a lot harder. And secondly, it's leaving inordinate saw marks in the back side of this board, which makes joinery really tough. I've already adjusted this and I think it's in pretty good shape. What I'm going to do now is send it through, and you should be able to hear cutting only at the front, and I'll kind of talk to you about when that happens. And when I finish that cut, there should be no cutting sound. Here's how it goes. Should be able to hear this cutting. And right when I get to here, shouldn't hear any cutting anymore through the saw. Since the saw only cut at the front of the blade, it's leaving a very clean, smooth line. When you look at the edge of this, it's nice and straight. And also, if you look at the edge of this, there's no secondary saw marks. That's a really nicely jointed board. And again, as thick, as wide, and as long as you want. Table saw works real well. Joiner works, but a table saw is just fine also. So no matter what method you use to joint the boards, they should fit evenly along their entire length. And with just a little hand pressure, should be able to push those boards together and flash them up against the light. And if you don't see light shining through those boards, you've got a perfectly jointed set of boards. In this case, it takes very little clamping pressure to hold those boards together to be glued. Now, if you use excessive clamping pressure to take boards and force them together, once the clamps are removed, you're relying on only the glue to keep them together for the extended service life of that project. As wood expands and contracts with seasonal changes in humidity, a well-fitted joint will stay together because there's no stress in that joint. Next, I would suggest that the boards you used in a glue-up are never more than 4 inches wide. I like to use narrower boards because I can be pretty assured that a board that starts 4 inches wide and flat across the end here with no cupping in it will stay that way. The wider boards have varying degrees of porosity and density across their face. And as they give off and take in moisture, they sometimes will react on the end grain and you get a small amount of cup. And that cup is deadly in a flat surface. So if you've got a prize board that you've wanted to use in a glue up like this, but you're afraid because of its width, you're afraid that it's going to cup across the back side of this, there's nothing wrong with cutting that board in half and re-gluing it. When you do that, the board looks as though it's a wide board, but it reacts like 2 smaller ones, and a lot of that internal stress has been removed by the cutting. In fact, if I haven't told you, this board is what I did that to. I've cut this board in half and re-glued it. You see if you can find the joint. And lastly, don't be too fast at thicknessing this material before you're ready to do your glue-ups. Where I buy my material, it's normally a little bit thicker than 3/4. In fact, if I put a gauge on this, you'll see the material is actually about 1/16 of an inch thicker than 3/4. It gives me plenty of room after my glue-up's done to do my thicknessing or my sanding and still have 3/4 when I'm done. Now those are the steps at getting all your work ready. Now it's time to get to the clamps and do a glue-up. So here's a few things that'll help make your glue-ups go a little bit easier. The first thing is to start with a flat surface. I've got a nice flat work table. I put a little craft paper over the top of that to protect that from drips. If you don't have a nice work table like this, your table saw works just as well. And again, make sure that you cover that to protect it. And as far as clamps goes, any clamps will work. Here's an example of a pipe clamp. This is a favorite used by a lot of woodworkers. The only concern I have with these is that they are somewhat unstable. There are plans available, and you can find them, to provide a little more support on the bottom to keep these clamps sitting a little bit flatter and a little bit less tippy on the table. I really enjoy bar clamps like these that sit flat on a surface. My feeling is if I have a flat surface and I've got a clamp that sits flat on that surface and boards that sit flat on a clamp, it gives me a much better chance of getting up a flat glue up when I'm done. Now, it's also a good idea to have some fresh glue on hand. Please don't use old glue. Glue that's been around much more than a year or so is just not as fresh as it should be. A nice fresh tube of glue will go well for you, especially if you've spent so much time and energy and money on putting a project together. Don't use something that's that old. Now, a dry glue up is a good way to start. This will show you where all of your potential problems are coming from. You'll notice in here what I can do is take my boards and put them in the clamps, and I'll spread my clamps about this far. Now, once I've done that too, I do want to protect the clamp edges from excess glue. I protected the table, and I think it's important to protect the clamps too. If you notice on the front here, there's a little bit of glue on the base of this clamp. These little serrated edges are what allows this clamp to hold well, and buildups of glue can cause a problem there. So once I've got my clamps somewhat set up to where I know that they're going to be, all I need to do is take a couple of pieces of painter's tape like this and protect those edges too. Any glue drip ups then will not get stuck on the clamp, And secondarily, there's no chance to mark the bottom edge of that glue up with any kind of the metal residue that comes from the bottom side of that clamp reacting with the glue. So here's our 3 boards set this way. And lastly, you can see that our clamps are set about 12 inches apart or so. With boards about 4 inches wide, the clamping pressure is spread pretty well with just 2 clamps spaced about 12 inches apart. So I only need 2 for this. Now there's no hard and fast rule. Normally the wider the boards, the wider the spacing of the clamps can be. The narrower the boards, the more clamps you'll need to be able to provide that same spread of glue. As far as the number of boards to use in a glue up, I prefer to do just 3. 3 boards gives me only 2 seams that I have to control. And with my fingers and my thumb, I can kind of feel the edge of those, so as I tighten the clamps, I can keep them aligned perfectly. When I'm done with a glue up like that, I have almost nothing that I have to sand off. When you're doing multiple boards, 5 or 6 boards, as you work your way down through the clamps, it's much harder to keep all those edges aligned. And if you're off just a 1/16 of an inch on any one of those edges on a multiple board glue up, it means you have to remove a 1/16 on one side and a 1/16 on the other side. You've reduced your 3/4 inch clamp up to something down to 5/8 by the time you're done. So I prefer to use just 3. Now you've got your boards laid out, it's time to put glue on them. And here's how I like to apply it. I put glue on just one edge of the board, like this. And then using my finger, I'll evenly spread that glue across the face of that board. And then to spread the glue to the other one, all I'm going to do is take these 2 edges and rub them together. And that brings glue onto both of them. And I'll do the same on this side. The same way. And the reason I'm doing this is because by adding glue this way to both sides, you don't have an excess amount of glue. That will provide a real nice glue line. So our glue is all applied. Let's put our boards in position and slide the clamps into line. And now it's time to align these edges. I'm going to use my finger and my thumb to control the alignment between each one of these 3 boards. Remember, there's only 2 seams. And I'm going to slowly tighten the clamps till I get them in those spots. So there we are there. And kind of follow it down the board like this until you're even here. So we feel pretty nice. Now our boards are close, and now all I have to do is put a half turn on either clamp. Now what you'll notice is the glue is beginning to bead up in spots here, and that's what I want. I want individual beads of glue and not a big mess of glue all over. I don't want a big pool of glue. It's time now, before you finalize this, to make sure that the board is sitting flat on the clamps and the clamps are flat on the table. And a quick look will assure me that all those edges meet very well. Now let's talk a little bit more about that pressure. I told you just a half a turn on each of these clamps was plenty. Talking to the glue manufacturers, we find that what it takes is about 175 pounds of pressure to push the glue into the edges of the boards on either side and provide the glue line down there that they feel is appropriate. Clamps like these can generate anywhere from 1,000 to 1,250 pounds of pressure. Clamps like this, anywhere from 450 to 600 pounds. Both of those more than enough pressure to push this together, and by over-tightening these, we just make the glue line thinner. In fact, really over-tightening these can sometimes make the whole glue up bow. So just enough pressure will work. Remember, these boards fit together so nicely by hand pressure, jointed at 90 degrees, that it only takes a little bit of pressure to provide the perfect glue up. Don't over-tighten. Now, one of the best ways to remove glue squeeze out is with a scraper. But using a scraper, I like to wait until the glue is dried to this popcorn-like consistency. It's not too moist inside, where like a blister it would spread glue onto the board surface. And it's not real dry to where when I do scrape it, I'll pull up a little sliver, which would be hard to scrape out of there. So this right now is this popcorn-like consistency. Taking a scraper like this will allow me to just scrape that glue right off and see how easily it comes out of that joint. Now if you don't have a scraper, it's real easy to use just a standard razor knife. I like to use a nice sharp blade. Use it with my fingers and thumbs and kind of bow the blade forward just a bit and actually use that to scrape forward. it does a really nice job removing that glue line just as well. Now don't be too fast to sand that glue up, and here's why. This is a representation of those two boards that we've glued together, and here's the joint, and we put glue on here. The moisture in that glue is going to temporarily raise or pucker the edges of that board. By sanding before the glue is completely dry, you'll remove that temporary puckering. But in the next few hours, when the rest of the moisture leaves that board, it will shrink back, and in effect what you're going to be left with is a dimple at each spot. Now another way to get rid of excess glue is to wipe it off. I like to keep it a bucket of water like this, a nice clean bucket of water and a rag. As soon as you've clamped up your glue up, take a relatively wet rag like this and immediately clean the glue from the surface of that board. And I'm going to do it on the top side like this, and then do it on the bottom side like this. And once I've gotten all that excess glue off, kind of clean my rag just a bit and get any of the excess glue off this rag. And then another quick wipe to remove any excess water from the back and any other potential glue. Now don't worry about wiping off the glue. It's not pushing glue down into the pores. We're wiping it off there and it's cleaning it perfectly off the surface of the board. That's also because we had just individual beads or a small bead of glue on the front, and that's what made it easy to clean it off. Had this been a slurry of glue or dripping all over the place and your bucket has gotten yellow because of all the glue you're actually cleaning off of there, then you do have some issues. But properly applied glue on one edge, then spread to the other, provides that very nice glue line, just the right amount of glue that can easily be wiped off with a rag. This works just great. The last thing about using 3 boards is that by gluing 3 boards at one time, 4 inches wide or less, you'll find the total glue up is less than 12 inches wide. That fits through every thickness planer or drum sander. If I'm doing a 36-inch wide glue up, I would do 3 board subassemblies. Each one of those would run through a thickness planer or drum sander, and when I come back to assemble those, again, I only have 2 seams I have to control. It's a whole lot easier than doing multiple boards. Now here's a quick tip on clamping up thin stock. Clamps placed like this only exert pressure over a short distance because the outside stock is so thin. Rather than filling this area with a lot of clamps, here's a quick, easy method to fix that. I just take a couple of larger pieces of stock on either side. When the clamps are set with these, by putting pressure here, I've extended that clamping pressure over a much greater distance. So less clamps, just a couple of big pieces will allow you to glue up a whole bunch of thin stock. Now you may have noticed that I didn't talk about biscuits or splines to reinforce these joints. To be honest, I just don't think that you need it. The edges fit so well together and the glues are so strong that this glue up will last forever. But there is a place for joint reinforcement. I see that as trying to take end grain like this and joining it to either edge grain, face grain, or end grain to end grain. When you look at end grain, what you're really looking at is a series of straws, and the only glue surface area is on the outside edge of those straws. So no matter how long you leave this clamped or under whatever kind of pressure you want, it doesn't take long to break those glue joints. Another place that you may need biscuits or splines is joining dissimilar materials, this MDF and this piece of poplar. What I'd like to do is show you first how biscuits can be used to reinforce these, then we'll go and show you how splines work. So the first thing I'll do is I'll kind of line these pieces up to make sure I have the correct faces up. I like to see the nicest faces. And because I want them to index off the tabletop, much the way the biscuit joiner does, I'm going to mark those faces and make sure that they always stay down. When we use biscuits, all we really need is a pencil line where you're planning on putting your biscuits. And remember when placing the lines for the biscuits to keep those biscuits away from the end of the board. That way if you have to trim the board off later, you won't be exposing the edge of those biscuits. Now you'll notice that I've got this board clamped to the table. I do it for a couple of reasons. The first is, of course, I want to make sure that it stays there while I press the biscuit joiner up to the face of it. But secondly, I want to make sure that that board is flat to the top of the table. If this board had a sense of humor, a small little bow to it, as long as I keep it clamped and I press it flat against the table, it's indexing against the top of this, much the same way as the bottom of this biscuit joiner is too. As long as both of these are flat on the table, the biscuit that I put in there will be parallel to the face. Here's how it works. I'm just going to match up the little index line on the front along with the pencil line I put in earlier, set my biscuit joiner up against the face, and press it in. Now we have two grooves set perfectly parallel to the face of that board. And of course we repeated these two cuts just like we did the first. Okay, now we'll take our biscuits, of course put glue on the edges and the biscuits and slide them into the slots. And put our two boards together. You'll notice the faces are exposed, and look at how nice that seam is. Now here's a way we can reinforce those joints with a spline instead of a biscuit. The spline will lie in the middle of both these boards and allow good glue surface area. And here's how it's done. The basic tenets are still the same. I want to find the nicest faces of these boards and put an X on them. I know that these boards are 3/4 of an inch thick, and I know that this spline is 3/4 of an inch wide. So the first thing we'll do is raise the table saw blade 3/8 of an inch. So I'll adjust my ruler to 3/8 of an inch and raise the table saw blade up to 3/8 of an inch. I know that the spline material is 3/4 of an inch wide, so I'd like the center of that blade to be 3/8 of an inch away from the fence. So using the same measurement, slide my fence over until it aligns with the center of the blade at 3/8 of an inch away from the fence. And now I've marked my boards with an X on the good face. Those good faces lie up against the face of that fence, so they're always indexing from the same spot. When I turn the saw on, I'm going to run each piece past there, and because I've indexed them the same way, that 1/8 inch blade will cut the perfect opening for this splice, and you'll see how they fit. So here's how it goes. Now here is how that spline joint goes together. A really nice joint. Now don't stress this joint immediately. Though you're going to find that glue has a good deal of strength soon after it dries, it has to cure completely to reach full strength. Normally I like to do my glue ups as the last thing of the day. After this sits overnight, I know what I've got is a board that's well dried and a glue that's well cured. So don't let glue ups like this challenge you. If you follow the simple steps that we've given you, you'll be rewarded with a great glue joint for years to come.